Okay, so that brings us to your practice and debating and arguing, and this is something that you do very well. In fact, you wrote a book about it, Win Every Argument. But what kind of mindset do you get into? Because the way you debate, the way you argue, many people say you're very different than everyone else. You're sharper, and you are able to talk to anyone in any circumstance. But how do you get into that zone? How do you prepare? What's the first thing that is there a specific routine that you get into before a debate?
It's a great question. Yeah. I don't think anyone's asked me that question. Do I have a routine?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, first thing is I try not to eat.
Not to eat?
I try not to eat.
Really?
Yeah, it's one thing people always like when I go to events. People are like, oh, would you like to have a meal? I was like, not before I speak. After. Whenever I do speeches or whatever. So
do you not feel hungry, or do you deliberately not eat?
I just deliberately, I just don't want to risk any. I just want to be in a place where I'm not worried about anything inside of me. I don't eat. I never share. Here's a weird thing. My wife made fun of me recently. I never share my remarks beforehand with anyone. Which is weird because it contradicts what I say in the book. So I apologize to people watching. And that's just a personal thing.
Yeah.
Don't follow me. Do as I say, not as I do. But maybe in the book, I make it very clear that when you're starting out as a public speaker, as a debater, someone who wants to communicate, make sure you practice in front of others, right? That's how you get confidence. A lot of people say, I can't stand up in front of 1 million people on television or 10,000 people in a hall. How do you do it? And I always say, start small. Start with a few people. Start around the dinner table. Start with your immediate family. Do a speech to your friend. Get smaller crowds. Go from 5 to 15 to 50, and then you'll get to 500, 5,000, 5 million, right? So that's 100%, and I stick with that advice. Me personally, maybe it's superstition, whatever it is, I don't like to share my remark. My wife will say, oh, what are you saying? What are you going to say in this interview? I say, when you watch it, you'll see.
Yeah.
She'll think, you're not even going to share it with me? And I'll say, no, I don't. Actually, recently I shared a speech with her, and she said, that's weird that you're sharing. You never normally share anything. So I just try and keep stuff to myself. Maybe it's the element of surprise. Maybe it's because I don't want to get feedback, but I don't know what it is.
Do you feel that you might dilute the message if you speak?
Maybe, or one of my favorite football players is Gary Lineker, a great England striker of the 1980s, 90s, now a TV host. And I got to interview him last year, which was a great fanboy moment for me. And he said something when I was a kid. I remember he said when other teams go out before the match begins and they're doing practices, he would never do any practice goals or penalties. He was like, I saved them for the game. I won't do it beforehand. So for me, it's like I'll save my remarks and my tone for the event. So that's something else I do. I mean, look, the main thing I do, which helps me win debates or arguments or at least try and get the better of an opponent, is I prepare like crazy. Like if somebody prepares 1 day, I'll prepare 3 days. If somebody prepares 1 week, I prepare 3 weeks. Like I'm excessive. I want to know, John Stuart Mill, I quote him in the book, the famous British philosopher, you cannot know your own side of the argument unless you know the other side of the argument and the best version of it. I take that one step further and say, you don't just need to know the best version of your opponent's argument, you need to know their argument better than they do. So when they say, well, did you know there's this study? I need to know beforehand what that study is that they're about to quote, and I need to have the rebuttal for that study and say, okay, but did you know that the study you're citing, it's been debunked by X, Y, or Z? So I think for me, the preparation is the key. One of the great mic drop moments, the bits I enjoy in interviews, is that moment where they say something and I'm just ready for it. I interviewed Vivek Ramaswamy,
yes, you did.
Who is a Republican politician, ran for president, tried to get a job with Donald Trump, but was recently pushed out of the administration before it even began, poor Vivek. And now I believe he's running for governor of Ohio. And when I interviewed him, he's a very smooth-talking, fast-talking, confident brown man. I was like, we have something in common. And he came on my show. He challenged me to a debate, so I invited him on the show. And he didn't really, I thought he might prepare and come. He didn't. But what was interesting was I had watched several interviews he'd done that week where the issue of a scholarship he had received in university from George Soros had become an issue for him because the right-wingers hate George Soros, the billionaire. And he had this line about, well, in university, he wasn't as rich as he was now. He needed the money. It wasn't too... So I watched those interviews. I knew that every time he cites, if you look at my tax return. So we got his tax returns, went through them, saw that he wasn't really telling the truth about the money. And it's a great moment in the interview when I bring up the Soros scholarship and he says, Mehdi, and you see his face, very cocky, thinking in his head, I've got a rebuttal to this. He says, if only you looked at my tax return. And then I pull up the tax returns on the screen, highlighted, and you see in his eyes, there's a moment, it's like, oh, I won't say the word on here, but oh. And it's kind of like that moment. For me, when I'm preparing, that is what I live for, right? Other people have great pleasures in life. That's my simple pleasure in life, getting that.
My question was, my next question is about this moment. Okay. Because these moments are tense.
Yeah.
They can be awkward.
Yeah.
And I've seen some even live arguments or live interviews.
They can be very awkward, especially in person. Vivek was remote.
Exactly.
But in person can be very...
In person can be awkward, let alone sometimes there's an audience.
Oh, yeah.
So
the audience is better.
Do you think so?
Audience is like a protective. So I do a show for Al Jazeera English called Head to Head, which we used to do at the Oxford Union. Now we do at Conway Hall in London. Having that audience shield is amazing. The guest can't BS you in the same way if it's just you and them. Because there's a whole audience watching who will laugh, who will take a deep breath, who will clap, who will sneer, whatever it is. So the audience is always I love live audiences. I live for the live audience shows. And the other reason is when it's all said and done, there's still an audience sitting there when the cameras stop rolling. So I'm protected by the audience. When I'm in a studio, I interviewed, I tell the story in the book, I interviewed the current mayor of Kyiv, Ukraine, former heavyweight champion of the world. Why am I having a mind block? Vitaly Klitschko.
Vitaly Klitschko, yeah.
Vitaly Klitschko.
His brother is Vladimir Klitschko.
Both brothers were heavyweights. He's mayor of Kyiv now. Yeah. I interviewed him when he became mayor of Kyiv before the Russian invasion of 2021. But while obviously Crimea was still occupied, and we talked about Russian politics, and he came on the show and he said to me, he's about 6'10" or whatever, he's huge. His arms are the size of my body. And he said, you must speak slowly. My English is not so good. And I said, all right, but I speak very fast, as everyone knows. So I told my producer, keep me in track in my, if I go too fast, just slow me down. So the whole first half of the interview, I was very slow speaking. I was like, English tourist. Can you show me the way to the, I was speaking very, like, did you tell what? And then eventually I got very relaxed with him and I went back to my talking very, very fast. And then I asked him about alleged connections he may have to Ukrainian mafia, which didn't make him very happy. And the interview's over now. And the cameras roll, and it's just me, him, and one cameraman, no one else in the studio, and he stands up, towering, and he says, you said you would speak slowly. And I thought, is he going to hit me? And if he hits me, am I going to die? And then, because I'm so shameless, I was like, but if he hits me, it'll go viral. And it was that viral death. Luckily, he didn't hit me. And a producer came in. I told my producer after, I said, from now on, whenever we have an awkward interview, you must rush into the studio to talk to the guests because it could get very uncomfortable. I interviewed Julia Gillard, former Prime Minister of Australia. And we talked about, does she have blood on her hands for all the asylum seekers drowning off the coast of Australia? And when the interview was over, she gave me a death stare and her team came in. And it was very, how long are you in DC for? Have you done any sightseeing? I was trying to make small talk. And she wasn't interested. She wanted to leave.
And those moments, what makes you push? Sometimes you push and they're already on their back foot.
Yes.
But you still keep pushing until you wait for a clear answer. Because a lot of people will just stop at this moment.
We'll move on, which is a great frustration.
Yeah, I mean, awkwardness, tense.
No, my principle, motto, whatever you want to call it. You answer the question. I'll keep interrupting you. I'll keep, people say, oh, you're interrupting. Oh, you didn't let the guest. I have so many people say, oh, you didn't let the guest speak. Well, because they were BSing me, or they were filibustering, or they were trying to change the subject. I have no qualms or apologies about interrupting a political guest if they're on my show and I ask them a question and they are blatantly not trying to answer it and go off somewhere else. Especially in the Trump era, everyone does it, especially right-wing guests. It's all filibustering. What about this? What about that? What about Biden? What about them? And they will not answer the question you pose to them. And too many cable anchors in the US, unfortunately, will say, all right, because they've got a producer in there saying, go to ad break. They've got time pressures. They'll say, all right, okay, well, let's move on to the next topic. My position is I don't care about the next topic. We're going to resolve this. One of my heroes journalistically is a British presenter called Jeremy Paxman, who was a very famous Newsnight host in the 1990s, 2000s when I was growing up and I was entering the media. And he famously was interviewing the Home Secretary of the UK in the late 90s, Michael Howard. It's a famous clip on YouTube. Your viewers can look it up. And he asked the same question 14 times because the Home Secretary wouldn't answer. And it was a very famous 14 times. He said, did you fire this prison governor? Did you? And it boom, 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 boom. And it was, for me, it was like, oh, what a great moment. Years later, it turns out, Paxman did an interview and he said, I wasn't trying to make a point. It's just the next segment had fallen through and they told me to keep going. So I just kept asking the same question. But at the time, we thought, what a journalistic hero. He wants an answer to his question. But anyway, so I try and follow that path.
Yeah. And speaking of these paths, sometimes paths that you try to follow do not work. And sometimes you'll have... And my question is here about the best performance that you've ever had and the worst one, or the one that maybe you learned from the most. So when we had Sheikh Dhakir Naik here, we asked him about his toughest debate, and he gave us a really nice story. So was there a specific debate that you remember that has been very tough?
There were a couple that were tricky because, I'll just do three very quickly. Number one, I did a debate on Greece and Germany about 10 years ago during the Eurozone crisis, the debt crisis. And it was in London. And one thing I learned, and if you read my book, the first chapter is on the importance of the audience, know your audience, win over your audience. And one of the reasons is that night, I didn't really prepare for that audience. I went with my good old leftist arguments, which I think were correct. And I had my stats and I had my talking points to get people really roused up about the state of poverty in Greece and how Greece was suffering because of Angela Merkel's austerity policies. The entire crowd at Intelligence Square in London had paid £50 tickets to come along. This was a well-heeled financial crowd. Even the Greeks in the audience were right-wing Greeks who were pro-German intervention. The audience was not sympathetic at all to my line of argument. I had to approach it from a very different angle. I approached it in an angle where that audience, we lost that debate. And I realized now it was mainly because I had the audience. And similarly, last year in Canada, I did the Monk debate, which is their big debate in Canada with Douglas Murray, who's an old, unfortunate debating foe of mine. And it was on anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Interestingly, the same topic, I won that debate in London.
With Levy?
But no, that was a different debate in New York. Okay. A few years ago, I did a debate on anti-Semitism versus anti-Zionism in the UK for Intelligence Square, and we won against Melanie Phillips, a right-wing journalist. Same debate in Toronto, we lost last year. But what was interesting was, again, the crowd was insane. Like they polled the crowd beforehand. It was 62% in favor of Murray's side before we began. In fact, when he walked on stage, the crowd cheered him like Taylor Swift had come on. I turned to Gideon Levy, the Israeli journalist who was on my side. I said, we've lost this debate. There's no way we can win this debate with this crowd. To the point where the crowd were booing everything we said, to the point where the Jewish crowd were booing a Jewish Israeli journalist who was talking about Palestinians being killed, and they were screaming, "You're a liar," at him. They booed me when I cited Oxfam. I said, who boos Oxfam? So the crowd, again, it reminded of the importance of the audience, knowing your audience, how to understand your audience, the role that the audience plays in a debate. And we lost that debate. And then, but we never had a chance. And the one that I always remember is I did an interview with the former head of the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence agency. His name is General Asad Durrani, retired chief. And it was a few years after the bin Laden killing. And I interviewed him on stage at the Oxford Union with a crowd. And this guy was insane. He was just no filters. You know, I'm used to like people, politicians, trying to dodge answering the question. Yeah. This guy didn't care. So I have all these questions, and he's just opening question. I'm like, doesn't Pakistan funds the Taliban, and isn't that? Yes, the Taliban are freedom fighters. Everyone here should support the Taliban. Huh?
Wow. What?
To a British crowd? I think that's illegal under British law. What you just said. So I'm like thrown from the first question, yeah. And his style of speech just threw me off. I was like, but you take money from America and then you give it to the Taliban. He goes, don't go to the circus if you can't ride two horses. What? What are you saying? And then there was a whole section we had on bin Laden at Abbottabad. It was like, surely the ISI knew bin Laden was hiding in Abbottabad. He goes, yeah.
Wow.
And I was like, so I've got like 7 follow-up questions. Where do I do now? I've like run out of time. I don't have enough questions to do the interview. The guy's just admitting to everything. So it was a different type of like tricky doing, not because I was losing, but because I didn't know what to do. I've never dealt with someone who's just so blunt. Like I'm used to people defending their positions or trying to evade a question. This guy was like, whatever.
Which interview you remember that you think that was your best performance? If you had to say, well, I want to repeat that performance, that type of performance. I just had a flow state, everything was working.
I think without a shadow of a doubt, it was the interview I did with Eric Prince, the former head of Blackwater Mercenary Company, about the Iraq War and about Blackwater and about his relations with Trump. And we did it at the Oxford Union. To begin with, I have no idea why he agreed to come on. To this day, people said, why did Eric Prince come on? I said, I don't know. If I was him, I wouldn't have come on my show. But he came on. Maybe it was the Oxford Union appeal. Comes on. Didn't do any real preparation, had no good answers. And it was the most viral interview I'd done at that time, at that point in my career. Actually, and the reason I have fond memories of that interview is because I really don't like Eric Prince. He's like, certain guests, you're just being fair. Certain guests, you're like, you stand for everything I'm against. This right-wing Republican, pro-Iraq war hawk mercenary company. And there were bits where, for example, I asked him why he called Iraqis barbarians, and he said, oh no, I was referring to ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And then I read from his book, and he didn't know that I had an exact quote from his book. Those are all great moments we've done. And then there was some great moments in that interview where my team, and credit to, I have a great team of researchers and producers, as I'm sure you do, and one of my producers just minutes before the show began found a press release from his company in English, because we'd been looking into his work in Xinjiang, China. He'd been criticized for the Uyghurs are being oppressed, about having a facility there. And I said to him at the time, I said, you've got this facility in Xinjiang. And he goes, oh, no, it's all been misunderstood. So I read, your company's bragging to you about the money they've... that's a Chinese statement. You've just mistranslated it. And there's a great moment you go, no, it's from your company website in English that we just printed out before the show. His face, like, there are some great moments. Like that interview is filled with great moments. And what's really good about it, two reasons is, number one, it actually established me in the US. I just moved to the US in 2015. A lot of people in America did not know me. People in the UK knew me. People in the Muslim world knew me from the Oxford Union debate. Americans didn't really know me. I was working for Al Jazeera, but that interview went, because he was a big figure in the Trump world at the time, that went mad viral to the point where Adam Schiff, who was one of the lead Democrats in the House at the time investigating Trump, referred Prince to the Department of Justice for alleged perjury because I exposed a lie he told to Congress under oath. So it really had real-world impact, plus it helped my career, which is great. Yeah. Plus it was fun to do because we actually nailed him on so many topics. So for me, Prince is a big one that I remember.
The US is a different market, isn't it?
Well, it's one of those worlds where they're very navel-gazing, and unfortunately, in the US, they don't really follow much outside of their borders, outside of their own media. So to break into that media for me was quite hard, and that was one of the ways I did it at the time.
Funny that you mentioned that he described the Iraqis as barbaric, and that